How to Create the Universe, The God Series Book 32, by Mike Hockney. This free audiobook series has been brought to you by the Foundation of Illuministic Guides. Contact the Foundation publicly as The Phoenix at tinyurl.com/foundation322. Check our foundation page at tinyurl.com/foundation323, and we have a posting group with many books and resources at tinyurl.com/foundation324. For the complete books that will be covered in this series, see tinyurl.com/Hockney322. Remember, there are many truths within lies and lies within fact. Truth is relative to the observer. The sign of a seeker is the quest for the truth. In that sign you shall conquer. Find the path in your own quest for the Gnostic grail of illumination. Choose wisely. We will be watching you. In a Hockney Chapter 10. No Buddha. Unlike the Buddha, we didn't work out any of this through introspection, through examining our subjective experiences, our feelings, our sensations, perceptions, or mystical notions. We worked it out through reason alone, exactly what the Buddha and all empiricists, including all scientists, refuse to do. Only one scientist has even got close to the concept of ontological mathematics, Max Tegmark, who at least looks to some kind of mathematical underpinning for reality. Perfect movement. How does a mathematical point move in order to satisfy the principle of sufficient reason? Remember that the principle of sufficient reason never privileges any valid state over any other equally valid state, or must be addressed equally and identically. It is exactly this requirement that explains existence. Only one shape can accommodate absolute equality of treatment. The circle, which is an instance of an n-sphere. Wikipedia says, in mathematics, an n-sphere is a generalization of the surface of an ordinary sphere to arbitrary dimension. For any natural number n, an n-sphere of radius r is defined as the set of points in n plus one-dimensional Euclidean space which are at distance r from a central point, where the radius r may be any positive real number. A zero sphere is the pair of points at the ends of a one-dimensional line segment. A one-sphere is the circle, which is the one-dimensional circumference of a two-dimensional disk in the plane. A two-sphere is the two-dimensional surface of a three-dimensional ball in three-dimensional space. S0. A zero-sphere is a pair of endpoints of an interval, minus r, of the real line. S1. A one-sphere is a circle of radius r. S2. A two-sphere is an ordinary sphere. S3. A three-sphere is a sphere in four-dimensional Euclidean space. Spheres for n greater than 2 are sometimes called hyperspheres. Wikipedia. All of the fundamental principles of existence flow from the zero sphere. Another view of the circle is as the entire real line with one extra point added to close the loop. The correspondence comes courtesy of a simple map called the stereographic projection. Similarly, the two-sphere is the entire infinite plane with one extra point, sometimes called the North Pole. In other words, the one sphere is much like a line, and the two sphere is much like a plane, with the one difference that they've been compactified by the addition of one extra point at infinity. Again, the three sphere is similar. It's just Euclidean 3D space with one slightly mysterious extra point glued on. Stereographic projections equate the circle and the sphere with the line and plane, respectively, each with an extra point at infinity. Barry Skipper. The zero sphere. A zero sphere is the pair of points at the ends of a one-dimensional line segment. Wikipedia. The significance of the zero sphere is much underrated. Conventionally, a linear process is considered to be radically different from a cyclical process. The former is apparently open-ended, never repeats, while the latter is closed, always repeats. Yet, when it is understood that there is a zero sphere associated with every line, then we realize that no linear process is truly linear. At any time, we can rotate the line and generate a one-sphere circle, so every linear process is in fact permanently shadowed by circularity. There is no such thing as a line not associated with a zero sphere, hence there is no such thing as a pure, open-ended, linear process, a process absolutely free of circularity. Circularity, via the zero sphere, is built into every linear process. Of course, linearity is equally built into every circular process. Every circle has a line segment, radius, at its core. Circles and lines are indissolubly linked. The formulas for the circumference and area of a circle, 2r and r2, show that linearity, via the radius, is always linked to circularity. Consider the area of a circle, r2, which we would express in functional terms as fr equals r2. If we differentiate this, we get 2r, the circumference. If we then differentiate this, we get 2, the constant applicable to all circles. Yet we must, by the inescapable logic of n-spheres, be able to associate 2 with a zero sphere. How do we do this? We have said earlier in the God series that ontological calculus allows meaningful differentiation to be applied to constants, an operation that results in nothing in conventional abstract calculus. Specifically, dimensional constants associated with space-time can be differentiated to produce dimensionless constants associated with frequency. So, 2-dimensional, associated with a one-sphere, circle, becomes, under differentiation, 2-dimensionless, associated with a zero sphere. At this stage, we are entering the frequency domain of monads. Imagine a frequency wave inside a monad, going on cyclically forever. In linear terms, we can model this via the introduction of the concept of the point at infinity. A point linked to a point at infinity maps to a zero sphere. A straight line linked to a point at infinity maps to a one-sphere, circle. A plane linked to a point at infinity maps to a two-sphere, regular sphere. A cube linked to a point at infinity maps to a three-sphere, hypersphere. So, linearly, an endless wave process inside a monad can be represented as a process traveling from one point to a second point positioned at infinity, that is as a point at infinity's zero sphere. Why do you think 2 pops up everywhere in quantum physics? It's because circularity, hence waves, are built into everything. There's no such thing as a linear world free of circles, waves and 2. There's not really any such thing as wave-particle duality. There are only waves, particular features of which can be interpreted as if involving particles. In fact, everything is derived from circular and hence wave motion. Pure linearity is impossible. All lines are shadowed by circles and waves. Circles and waves are implicit in all lines. This has the most profound implications for mathematics. It means that there's not really any such thing as the number line. There is no such thing as a pure Cartesian linear grid either. Rather, the Cartesian grid is fully underpinned by dimensionless frequency monads, hence circles, waves and 2. The Cartesian grid, as conventionally represented, is an abstraction, not ontological. To be made ontological, it must be understood to be indissolubly linked to invisible monads in a singularity. The singularity is the Cartesian origin. It's the frequency, mental, domain at the heart of the space-time, material, domain. You can never validly refer to space-time without also referring to the singularity. This, in fact, is the whole problem with science. Science, even though it acknowledges the space-time universe erupting from a singularity at the Big Bang, then denies the ongoing existence of this singularity, which in fact goes on controlling space-time as the cosmic mind to the cosmic body equals universe. The singularity is the mysterious ether that Einstein absurdly abolished, for which he was patted on the back by all of science, and proclaimed a genius. Ironically, many scientific geniuses are guilty of monumental blunders that have had catastrophic effects on humanity's understanding and knowledge of reality. Equally, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and quantum mechanics make no reference to an ontological monadic singularity, a permanent frequency domain. Note that quantum entanglement is instantly explained via this singularity outside space and time. It's exactly this catastrophic omission that ensures that no scientist knows what quantum mechanics actually means. Scientists are missing the critical ingredient, the mental singularity, that defines the whole system. Of course, the ideology and dogma of science is wholly opposed to granting the existence of a mental singularity, which would necessitate the abolition of scientific empiricism and materialism, and its replacement by scientific rationalism and idealism, equals ontological mathematics. This is why science must be regarded as a mythos religion. It will never contemplate anything outside its faith in the primacy of matter and the senses. It will never challenge its belief system. It rejects anything out of hand that does not conform with its religious worldview. It scoffs at anyone who opposes materialism. It even scoffs at everyone who supports rationalist mathematics, while failing to acknowledge that science without rationalist mathematics is a joke and meaningless. But the academic mathematical community is not much better. Abstract mathematicians have no understanding of the greatest tool in mathematics, calculus. Calculus, without reference to Leibnizian monads, is absurd. Leibniz, the discoverer of calculus, and the greatest genius in human history, was the only person who fully understood calculus, and the fact that it must be intrinsically tied to monads. The rest of the mathematical community, while accepting Leibniz's notation and basic approach to calculus, bar the monads, essentially followed Newton's space-time, scientific, understanding of calculus. Space-time, material, calculus is formally false. Only space-time calculus grounded in frequency, mental, calculus is valid. That is, calculus must be underpinned by monadic frequency domains located in a singularity, cited at the origin of the Cartesian coordinate grid. All calculus processes must refer to this invisible singularity. The conventional calculus of limits is wrong. All of calculus must begin and end with monads, yet these are explicitly what the calculus of limits denies. We need a brand new understanding of the Cartesian coordinate grid. It needs to have an ontological singularity, a mind, placed at its origin. The singularity is the Fourier frequency domain, and the rest of the grid the Fourier space-time domain. The Big Bang is nothing but a Fourier process creating space-time from the frequency singularity, the Cartesian origin. The Cartesian grid must be replaced by the Fourier Cartesian grid, reflecting frequency as well as space-time. More or less the whole of science, and most of abstract mathematics, is conceptually false because the standard Cartesian grid is what is used to support science and abstract mathematics, and this grid automatically reflects space-time, extension, dimensionality, materialism, empiricism, and the senses. Descartes himself was certain of the existence of unextended, dimensionless thinking substance, yet it does not feature at all in his own Cartesian grid. This can be rectified at a stroke by replacing the empty Cartesian origin with a Fourier frequency domain, a singularity composed of countless monads, each of which is a self-contained frequency domain equals a mind, a soul. The whole of the mind-body interaction can be understood as soon as we place a mental domain at the heart of the space-time domain. Fourier mathematics automatically takes care of the whole thing. The critical problem is that people just cannot conceive of this invisible, noumenal, transcendental, transcendent, Platonic domain of immutable, perfect, eternal forms. They regard it as unreal and abstract. In fact, it's the essence of existence, and the most concrete thing you can possibly get. The problem is that only reason and intellectual intuition can take us there, but people reject these in favor of their feelings, faith, their senses, empiricism, materialism and science, and their non-intellectual intuitions, Eastern mysticism. Only the brightest of all human beings can grasp that pure reason lies at the core of existence, and that the principle of sufficient reason rules the universe via its ontological expression, the God equation. Only rational people can understand reality. Only rational people can see that pure reason must be placed at the origin of the Cartesian grid to make it ontological, to make it Pythagorean, Platonic, Gnostic, Hermetic, Neoplatonic, Leibnizian and Hegelian. That is illuminated. The complex plane. The complex plane is the plane of complex numbers spanned by the vectors 1 and I, where I is the imaginary number. Every complex number corresponds to a unique point in the complex plane. The line in the plane with I equals 0 is a real line. The complex plane is sometimes called the Argand plane or Gauss plane, and a plot of complex numbers in the plane is sometimes called an Argand diagram. The complex plane together with the point at infinity is known as the Riemann sphere or extended complex plane. http://mathworld.wolfram.com/complexplane.html. The Cartesian grid. Arguably, nothing has had a greater impact on human thought than the Cartesian grid. It's the basis of both mathematics and science. All Euclidean space-time thinking originates here. All Newtonian thinking originates here. Empiricism and materialism are stamped all over the Cartesian grid. It contains the entirety of John Locke's understanding of the application of mathematics to the primary properties of the things of the empirical world. But reality is actually about circles, waves, frequencies, non-Euclidean geometry, projection, zero, infinity and complex numbers, none of which feature in the standard grid, because the wrong grid is used to depict reality, the Cartesian grid. Scientists and mathematicians can't help falling into the wrong ways of thinking. The correct grid, the one that reflects reality, is the Fourier-Gauss-Riemann grid, but this is A, much more difficult to represent, B, contains invisible elements, monadic zero, infinity frequency domains equals minds, and non-empirical, imaginary, hence complex numbers. C. It contains curvature. That's why it has proved so difficult for it to gain any traction. Quantum mechanics, special and general relativity, and quantum gravity would all be solved in a trice. Well, in a decade, if the science and mathematics communities switched from the Cartesian grid to the Fourier-Gauss-Riemann grid. The only reason they don't is that the former grid is compatible with empiricism, materialism and conventional science, while the latter emphatically isn't. The latter grid demands that you accept the ontology of mathematics. You must accept monads, minds, singularities, zero, infinity, imaginary and complex numbers. This means that you have fully acknowledged that the universe is mathematical, not scientific. It means that you have turned to scientific rationalism and idealism, and permanently away from scientific empiricism and materialism. It means that you have rejected Newton and embraced Leibniz. It means that you accept philosophy, metaphysics, reason, logic, deduction, analysis, ontology and epistemology as essential to the understanding of reality, and you no longer worship naive sensory experiments, as science does. It means that you are concerned with rational proof and not empirical evidence. In other words, it means that you support the ultimate intellectual paradigm shift, away from the temporal, contingent human condition and towards the eternal, necessary viewpoint of God, a mathematical God, naturally, and nothing to do with morality, prophets, gurus, holy books, sacred scriptures, commandments, chosen people, infidels, heretics, blasphemers, apostates, circumcision, and bans on bacon sandwiches and beadlessness. How can you become a god unless you adopt God's viewpoint, and transcend your fallible, unreliable, limited humanity, with your narrow and dubious human senses, feelings and pathetic little experiences? Only mathematics can provide a final, grand unified theory of everything. To arrive at this definitive theory, you must first identify the definitive grid that supports the ontological ground of reality. The conventional Cartesian grid is perfect for modeling the concept of the material world of space-time. Newtonian physics is so embedded in the human imagination because it's nothing but science worked out on a Cartesian grid. Einsteinian special relativity is what you get when you replace a real numbered Cartesian grid with a complex numbered Gaussian grid. General relativity is what you get when you add Riemannian non-Euclidean geometry to the Gaussian grid. Quantum mechanics is what you get when you add a Fourier frequency grid to the Gauss-Riemann grid. There is no further grid. The history of science is literally the history of the following grid progression. 1. Pre-Newtonian science, no grid, hence unmathematical. 2. Newtonian physics, reflecting the standard Cartesian grid, and Euclidean geometry. This is the simplest mathematical version of science. It's no surprise at all that it appeared first. Of course, Leibniz had produced an infinitely more sophisticated theory of reality, based on monadic holography, but this was rejected by the intellectual community. Leibniz, a real genius, was centuries ahead of his time, while Newton, a minor genius, was exactly a man of his time, appealing to common sense. 3. Einsteinian special relativity, reflecting the Gauss grid. In Einsteinian special relativity, time takes the role of imaginary numbers. Although this is widely recognized, no one actually assigns any ontological reality to time as imaginary numbers. This equivalence is simply taken to be a calculational convenience, and real numbers can in any case be substituted, using an appropriate mathematical trick. Wikipedia says, Henri Poincaré showed that by taking time to be an imaginary fourth space-time coordinate, -1 ct, a Lorentz transformation can be regarded as a rotation of coordinates in a four-dimensional Euclidean space with three real coordinates representing space, and one imaginary coordinate, representing time, as the fourth dimension. In a further development, Minkowski gave an alternative formulation of this idea that used a real-time coordinate instead of an imaginary one, representing the four variables, x, y, z, t, of space and time in coordinate form in a four-dimensional affine space. Points in this space correspond to events in space-time. In this space, there is a defined light cone associated with each point, and events not on the light cone are classified by their relation to the apex as space-like or time-like. It is principally this view of space-time that is current nowadays, although the older view involving imaginary time has also influenced special relativity. Wolfram Mathwold says, Minkowski space is a four-dimensional space possessing a Minkowski metric, that is, a metric tensor having the form d2 equals dx02 plus, dx12 plus, dx22 plus, dx32. Alternatively, though less desirably, Minkowski space can be considered to have a Euclidean metric with imaginary time coordinate x0 equals x, where c is the speed of light, by convention c equals 1 is normally used, and where I is the imaginary number I equals s squared t minus 1. Minkowski space unifies Euclidean 3 space plus time, the fourth dimension, in Einstein's theory of special relativity. It's always possible to produce mathematical tricks to avoid confronting the imaginary nature of time. The complex plane is the simplest way to model Einsteinian special relativity. Newtonian absolute space and absolute time, represented by independent real numbers, are replaced by interlinked complex numbers, thus creating fused space-time. You can't make any change to space without affecting time, and vice versa. Thus we have a set of dynamic relations of time dilation and length contraction. There is nothing in special relativity to explain why the speed of light is fixed and absolute. This is simply something imposed on the theory by postulate. The theory investigates what happens given this postulate. It doesn't explain the postulate. Einstein famously abolished the ether, hence abolished the old Newtonian grid for absolute space and absolute time, and replaced it with inertial frames of reference, which could be rationalized in terms of 4D Minkowski spacetime, where the spacetime interval between any two events is independent of the inertial frame of reference in which they are recorded. But the ether hasn't gone away. The ether is actually the immaterial, unobservable frequency domain of Fourier mathematics, where everything travels at light speed. Light doesn't travel through the ether. Light is the ether, which is exactly why it is fixed and constant, and provides an absolute framework for the entire material world. As ever, a famous scientist, Einstein in this case, got his coordinate grid wrong, hence produced a fallacious theory. 3. General relativity, reflecting a Gaussian grid with curvature. Special relativity excludes forces. With the introduction of forces, the fabric of space-time curves. Einstein said, when forced to summarize the general theory of relativity in one sentence, time and space and gravitation have no separate existence from matter. John Wheeler said, mass tells space-time how to curve, and space-time tells mass how to move. It's necessary to leave behind flat space and accommodate curved space. We need Riemannian, non-Euclidean geometry. 4. Quantum mechanics, reflecting a Gauss-Riemann grid subject with a Fourier frequency domain added to it. QM is all about wave-particle duality. But where do the waves come from? They originate in the Fourier frequency domain. This is the domain of mind, while the Gauss-Riemann grid is the material domain of Fourier space-time, body as opposed to mind. Of course, scientists have no idea how to understand QM, so they blabber on about unreal, abstract mathematical potentiality wave functions, and the like. That is things with no ontology. 5. Ontological mathematics, reflecting the full Fourier Gauss-Riemann grid as ontologically real, and getting rid of the Cartesian Euclidean grid once and for all. There is nowhere else to go. This is the end of the line. This provides for the final theory of everything. You cannot get your understanding of reality right unless you are using the correct mathematical grid, the ontological grid. Religious mythos and mysticism use no grid at all. Philosophy uses no grid. Science, in effect, has never shaken off the Euclid-Descartes-Newton grid. Ontological mathematics demands a much more complex grid, that of Gauss, Fourier and Riemann. The grid fully mathematically supports the monadic holographic system produced by Leibniz. Leibniz was simply too smart to be appreciated by his empiricist, materialist contemporaries. Newton was the man for them. Leibniz was the true genius, Newton the false genius, just as Abraxas is the true God and Jehovah, the demiurge, Allah, equals the false God equals the devil. If you have no ontological grid depicting reality, you have nothing. You have no idea what you are talking about. You are in the land of mythos and fantasy. The tragedy for the human race is that our senses and feelings have evolved with respect to the simplistic Euclid-Descartes-Newton space-time grid, the grid compatible with empiricism, materialism and real numbers. This model gets the job done with minimum fuss. Its truth content is neither here nor there. The ancient Greek atomists believed in little hard lumps, atoms, whizzing about in a void, colliding with each, coming together and breaking apart. That remains the basic conception 99% of humans have of reality. The religious amongst them are willing to place some undefined soul from another dimension, or no dimension at all, in the midst of a body made of atoms. When the person dies, and his atoms go their separate ways, the body turns to dust, the soul goes on. This is the basic model of Cartesian dualism. No one worries about the fatal interaction problem produced by dualism. How do substances with different, incompatible properties interact with each other? Descartes himself couldn't fit an unextended domain of mind into an extended domain of matter. The ingredient he was lacking was an immaterial Fourier frequency domain outside space and time. A domain of monadic singularities, souls. It interacts with the Fourier space-time domain via forward and inverse Fourier transforms. What could be simpler? As soon as you abandon the naive Euclid-Descartes-Newton grid, you automatically leave behind science, empiricism and materialism, and are forced to enter the rationalist, idealist world of ontological mathematics. You are forced to turn to reason, logic and metaphysics. Experiments won't help you. Experiments are only as good as our senses, and our senses evolved with regard to the simple Euclid-Descartes-Newton grid, not the complex Gauss-Fourier-Riemann grid. You can literally forget experiments as any kind of worthwhile tool to investigate the world of ontological mathematics. Newton can't save you, only Leibniz can. Empiricism is dead, rationalism rules. All things are numbers. As Pythagoras said, number rules all. Sensory people regard reason and logic as unreal and abstract. What that means is that they are not willing to consider any reality beyond that of the sensory Euclid-Descartes-Newton grid. They are stuck with their childish, simplistic beliefs regarding things, physical stuff. They can't imagine mathematical, mental objects that have no sensory qualities whatsoever. These people simply aren't intelligent enough. Only humanity's finest, highest minds can grasp ontological mathematics, can overcome their delusional senses and their touching belief of matter. What lies beyond science is math. It's as simple as that. What lies beneath science is math. What props up science is math. Science without math is divination or skepticism. Haven't you got the memo yet? Science is an absurdity. It's a staging post on the journey from emotional mythos religions to intuitive philosophy, and then on to rational mathematics. Science is the sensory stage of intellectual development. When unsophisticated thinkers imagine that their senses are showing them reality, that empirical evidence is what knowledge is about. In fact, knowledge is about rational proof. It's about infallible arguments based on the eternal truths of reason, logic and mathematics. It's nothing to do with sensory experiences. As David Hume realized, sensory experiences can't explain anything, and can't provide any knowledge at all. Science, if it couldn't call on rationalist mathematics, would not be able to make any sense at all of sensory experiences. They are simply not things that can be considered intelligible. They are forever sensible, and nothing more than that. Only rational things, that is mathematical things, are intelligible.